I want to thank Professor Simpson for inviting me here. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I suppose that many of you have thoughts about what happened or transpired last evening with the debates, and we can talk about that, but I really want to start that discussion by talking about the implications of Barack Obama's election for Black politics, or politics aimed directly at challenging inequality head on. I want to first start off by discussing how did I get interested in this topic. And my juices really began to flow during the election in 2008. But particularly, there was a New York Times Magazine piece that came out in August 2008 titled, "Is Obama the End of Black Politics?" Is Obama the end of Black politics? And the piece was written by the reporter Matt Bai, and he gave this what I thought an overly simplistic perspective on the explanation for the rise of a politician, a Black politician like Barack Obama. He gave this sort of generational explanation about the sort of the changing of the guard of the civil rights movement generation of Black leaders, people like John Lewis, who is a congressman from my hometown of Atlanta, or people like Julian Bond, who also in Atlanta, I don't know why I put these two examples, who used to be my state senator growing up in Atlanta. And he pitted those against people like Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, Arthur Davis, who is now many people see as a turncoat, who was a congressman from Alabama, who's now a Republican. But this was sort of the development of a new generation of Black politicians who were technocrats, who were interested in issues that affect everyone, not centered on Black issues, or use that term, which I hate when I hear it, Black grievances, as opposed to sort of this newer generation that seemed to be sort of race neutral or race didn't matter. I thought there was an overly simplistic perspective on the reasons for the rise of Barack Obama, and so I wrote this book, The Price of the Ticket. And I'll tell you the meaning of that title in a moment. And so what this book does is place the rise of Barack Obama within the context of Black political struggles in this transition from the protests of the 1960s into electoral politics. That moment in the late 1960s to the early 70s, where the focus began to be pushed on electoral politics becoming the dominant mode of Black political struggle. There are lots of reasons for this: the repression of Black movements, Black radical organizations by the government, Black Panthers, et cetera, which limit to the possibilities of what politics would look like. But also the changing demographics of cities during this period, where you begin to see Black majorities growing in many cities, places like Newark, New Jersey, Gary, Indiana, other cities where African Americans began to, Atlanta, my hometown, begin to be elected to mayor or in places where there were majority Black electorates. But there were two philosophical perspectives that developed right around the 1960s. I don't know if you can recall Malcolm X's speech, The Ballad of the Bullet, where he really talked about the importance of community-centered politics, where issues were much more important than the political parties that represented the constituencies. And we saw that very much articulated very clearly in a very popular book that was published in the late 1960s by the political scientist formerly of Columbia University, Charles V. Hamilton, and the Black Power advocate Stokely Carmichael, Black Power, the Politics of Liberation, where they really began to sort of articulate the importance of a issue-driven, community-centered perspective on electoral politics. Now, this is juxtaposed against another school of Black politics that developed around this time, mostly by Dr. King's lieutenant, Bayard Rustin, who talked about the importance of building coalitions with sympathetic whites, particularly with labor unions, and he talked about the importance of African Americans being incorporated or drawn within the Democratic Party, right? And so, and it was also the emphasis on the need for universal policies, policies that would bring all these coalitions together, right? And so he wrote this piece in Commentary magazine, and it was called From Protests to Politics, right? And so you have these two perspectives that are developing. And in fact, during the ensuing years, when we looked at African Americans, particularly running for president, there would be this back and forth between these two perspectives. 1972, with Shirley Chisholm running as president. I was very much disappointed in 2008 when you had a viable woman and a viable black person running in a Democratic primary, and the name Shirley Chisholm didn't come up hardly at all, if not. Shirley Chisholm ran in 72. And she used this universalist framework to talk about how that, you know, she wanted to represent people who were disenfranchised. She tried to rally feminists, African Americans. Also, the first Democratic candidate who was sympathetic to gay and lesbian issues. This is 1972, right? And she did not very well, even among black voters, but she tried to use the delegates that she had accrued as leverage. And this is when sort of the independent black politics of thinking came into play within the Democratic Party convention. She went to black delegates who were committed to the other candidates, said, guys, come along with me, right? We can use this as a leverage, particularly for black issues, as well as progressive issues. And unfortunately, it didn't work. And so there at that moment, we see the tensions between the independent black politics perspective and the need for coalition building. If you remember Jesse Jackson's two elections during the 1980s, also this back and forth between independent black politics and coalition building. Remember the 84 thing was, it's our time now, right? Using very consciously the idea of accruing the black vote, getting black delegates, using it as a means to, using that leverage to put issues that are important to poor people, to African Americans, on the agenda for the Democratic Party. 1988, quite different. It was the Rainbow Coalition, right? So we're going back. All these things have their origins at that moment in the 1960s. And Jesse Jackson did very well. He won a Michigan caucus. He got 20% of the white vote during the primary. And he talked about dislocated workers, but he never ran away from the issue of race. That was still very important. And he tried to use the leverage of the mostly black delegates to make changes within the Democratic Party, which I would argue helped Barack Obama decades later. One key point I want to make, and that's the changes in the allocation of delegates, which Jackson insisted on in 1988 because he thought that there was this winner-take-all rules within congressional districts in some states that disadvantaged candidates who didn't have the name recognition, who were not viable, but they still accumulated those delegates, particularly in large states, right? And I argue, had Jesse Jackson not pushed for those changes in 1988, Barack Obama may have not gotten the nomination in 2008. Why? Because Hillary Clinton won most of the large states that were rich in delegates. California, Texas, Ohio, Pennsylvania. If the Jackson rules were not put in place, and it was, as you remember, a very closely contested race, Barack Obama may have not gotten the nomination. So I wanted you to look at sort of the benefits of this coalition, the importance of politicians having to build these coalitions, as well as the importance of independent black politics to put issues that are particular to black communities on the national agenda. But also there's another mechanism, aspect that it's operating here. And so as Professor Simpson noted, I'm very attuned to history. And so what we saw with the so-called race-neutral campaign strategy of Barack Obama, who didn't mention race but talked about the importance of bringing people together, racial unity, that goes back for decades, particularly in the 1980s, when many black elected officials felt that they were meeting a glass ceiling, that they couldn't be elected outside of their majority black constituencies, and they had aspirations for running for mayors in cities that didn't have majority black constituencies, or even in the case of Virginia, they wanted to become governor. And so you begin to see this strategy called deracialization. This is something that scholars of black politics coined. And so what we have here is this strategy where minority candidates, particularly black candidates, de-emphasize race and race-specific policies, in particular affirmative action, which is a hot-button issue, among other issues, and talk about the importance of racial unity, bringing people together. I would argue that in combination with this idea of the coalition wing of black politics that looks at the universal aspect of policies that's happening to everyone and keeping the coalition together, that campaign strategy of deracialization and universalism list approach to black politics, as a consequence, put black issues, specific issues that are particular to black communities off the political agenda, right? And here I'll get to this question about the price of the ticket. Now, in addition to this, there are a lot of ideological changes that are happening in the black community. And when I say ideological, I'm not just talking about liberal versus conservative, but there are battles within black communities. They are not seen usually as ideological battles, but around issues, for instance, about the direction of Afro-Christianity. You have these tensions between the prosperity gospel, which is about transforming individuals, making them much more, materialistically prosperous for themselves and their communities, versus the theology of liberation / the social gospel tradition, which is about transforming individuals, but also transforming communities, right? And so you have this, what I would call a theological civil war going on. I mean, you guys know the very, popular prosperity gospel ministers, Creflo Dollar is very popular on television, and also just among white evangelicals too, people like Joel Osteen, who also has a large following. So that's one ideological battle that's happening within black communities that I would argue feed into this coalition wing, or even the idea of deracialization, because it's, no matter what the social barriers that may exist, God is going to bless me anyway because I'm faithful, because I give to the church and give to the minister. And so none of these other things really matter. That's how it sort of feeds into this idea of deracialization. And also, there's another ideological battle that's always been a part of the black community around social class. And that's around the politics of respectability, which emerged in the late 19th century. And it wasn't a Du Boisian sort of Booker T. Washington difference, because they both agreed on this idea that although Booker T. Washington didn't believe in the talented 10th, he believed that black people could be respectable and present a very positive face to white America by just being virtuous, hardworking. Du Bois thought that the talented 10th would do that for. I call them in my book, it's the talented 10th and then there's the untalented 9/10ths. Right, and so part of this, we hear this to understand, for instance, the rhetoric of the Bill Cosby, right, about the need for sort of, ghetto kids to pull themselves up, not looking at the social barriers, economic and social barriers these communities face, to understand Barack Obama's Father's Day speech, which I would say was pivoted both ways. You have to remember Barack Obama, when he gave that speech around Father's Day, he had to basically, he had it clinched, but he was losing in places like West Virginia, other states that had large white working class constituencies. And so the politics of respectability worked both ways. it gave us, you know, it's something that, you know, African Americans, because of this legacy, say, oh yeah, that's right, you know, folks need to be, you know, he gives a speech during the Texas primary in Beaumont about, in a mostly majority black audience, waving his finger saying, we need to stop feeding our kids cold Popeye's chicken for breakfast in the morning. They need to be healthy. They need to, this sort of politics of respectability, and it worked both ways. People in black audiences appreciated it, but also it gave a signal to white working class voters that he was not going to be the favorite of minority interests, right? So these are the ideological contestations that are happening within black America that get pretty much ignored by the mainstream media. So the rest of the time I'm going to use, because I know you guys have questions, I'm going to read an excerpt from the book. And so I'm going to begin with this. In 1971, a British journalist noted during a televised interview of Muhammad Ali that the boxer was the second most prominent American after President Richard Nixon. The journalist then asked the world's heavyweight champion whether he would like to be president. Ali answers with an emphatic no. Too dangerous, the boxer quipped. Now, Ali's concern about being the president of the United States was not only because of the potential violence that might be directed against him for being a black man holding the most powerful position in the world. His resistance also was due to the extraordinary challenges that would likely confront him as the nation's first black president. Like, in other words, Ali begins to inform the journalist, there's a ship. People are dancing on the ship, a lot of money is on the ship, a lot of food is on the ship, and I cannot integrate the ship. I can't have equality on the ship, he says. I'm just in the galley working, and I could never get up and see the captain of the ship. Ali explains while rubbing his forehead. Now, all of a sudden, the man tells me, say, come on down, Ali, out of the galley. Hi, I want you to have something to drink. What do you want? Giving me the #1 spot from the galley to the #1 spot, he continued. This ship must be sinking. Why is he so nice to me, Ali continues. What moves him to call me here? Black men have been mayors, now one might be president. America is in too much trouble. I don't want that job now. 1971. Now, Ali's comedic reflection on the circumstances that would likely produce the nation's first black president is prophetic. With the election of Barack Obama as the 44th president of the United States, one could easily draw the conclusion that black America has reached the pinnacle of political empowerment, a journey that has taken blacks from being one of the most marginalized groups in American history to being a key constituency that helps elect a man of African descent to lead the nation. But the economic conditions of the nation that greeted Obama after he was inaugurated and the race-neutral political rhetoric that helped put him into the White House puts the significance of Barack Obama's election for black America in doubt. Far from black America gaining greater influence in American politics, I would argue, Obama's ascendancy to the White House actually signals a decline of politics aimed at challenging racial inequality head-on. Now, scholars, journalists, and political analysts who have commented on race and politics in the wake of Obama's rise view his success as either an illustration of American progress in race relations, or view Obama like any other president who, whether Democrat or Republican, represents the interests of the rich and powerful. The only difference now, these critics would argue, is that the new head of state has a black face. Now, both supporters and critics of Obama have tried to deconstruct his lack of attention to racial issues and policies by speculating on the president's inner thoughts. Now, some have argued that Obama's biracial heritage accounts for his ambivalence on racial issues, which I think is a stupid argument. One by a very brilliant man who I admire, Cornel West, has made this argument. Now, some have argued that others believe that the president is reluctant to speak out on racial issues because he does not want to be branded an angry black man. And still others think that the president is embracing a stealth strategy, quietly supporting black issues behind the scenes, out of the sight of right-wing detractors. And that's sort of from the Booker T. Washington school of black politics. Now, like reading tea leaves for clues, these commentators search the pages of Obama's autobiography to find racializations for one point or the other. And some commentators even try to decipher Obama's perceived uses of cultural cues, like the gestures he makes during speeches or his occasional use of black slang and dialect, to argue that Obama is sending signals to black voters to reassure them that he is one of them. You know, the fist bumps, the cool walk. Yeah. Yeah, was that from Jay-Z? You know, I'm not into hip hop that much, so someone has to explain some of the cues to me, actually.
Some of the people in Fox News say Mr. Jay-Z.
Mr. Jay-Z, okay. Now, in my book, I go beyond the armchair psychologizing of Obama that too often passes as serious political analysis. So trying to dig into the inner thoughts of the president's view on race is, I would argue, best left to presidential historians who, as time passes, will have the benefits of primary sources and the distance of time to comment on Barack Obama's stint in the White House. Now, so my perspective on this places Obama's race-neutral campaign strategy and approach to governing within the context of history, politics, and policy. History, politics, and policy. The book takes as its premise that Obama, just like any other president or candidate for the White House, makes strategic decisions about what issues to prioritize, what constituencies receive more or less attention, and what risks are to be taken when pushing forward a policy agenda. Now, my analysis takes discussions about Obama's presidency back to a fundamental question that still holds resonance for black politics today. What is the best strategy for black communities to pursue their political interests? And when I say interests here, I'm recognizing that some of those interests are universal, like universal health care. I think the president should be congratulated, for instance, for pushing through the health care because a fifth of African Americans are uninsured. But on the other hand, there are community-centered issues like criminal justice reform, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, where there could have been opportunities, it seems to me, to push forward an agenda. And so we can talk about that because some people say, well, that can be used against us, it's too race identified, but I'm going to show you in a moment why putting pressure is important. So I talked about the two views that have dominated black politics, the coalition school as well as the independent school. And I talked about the whole idea of deracialization. So, but here with this coalition, this focus on coalition building, which he has to do as a president, but also I'm more critical, and not so much of Obama the candidate, but black communities for really agreeing to this bargain of the focus on exclusively issues that are affect everyone, as well as this deracialization strategy. And here's what I say. I say I believe, many ways, the majority of black voters have struck a bargain, a Faustian bargain, with Obama. When it comes to speaking on race and poverty, President Obama has been unusually silent. As the New York Times columnist Charles Blow reported on January 28, 2011, President Obama has spoken less about the poor or poverty in State of the Union addresses than any president since Harry Truman. That's more than a generation. That's at least 2 generations. And as the University of Pennsylvania political scientist Daniel Gillian has documented, that the president has mentioned race in speeches and in public documents in his first 2 years of office less than any Democratic president, and on average, slightly less than all presidents, including Republicans, since 1961. So total silence, public silence around issues of poverty, as well as issues of race. Now, so in exchange for the president's silence on community-focused issues, many black voters are content, I would argue, with a governing philosophy that helps all people and a politics centered on preserving the symbol of a black president and a black family in the White House. Now, the symbol of a black president is not a trivial matter, I would argue. No one recognizes the power of Obama's symbolism, particularly for black youth, more than I do. And it hit me a year into Obama's term when my then 2.5-year-old son asked his preschool teacher to pen the following letter. Dear Daddy, I miss Daddy. I want an ice cream, and Daddy said later. I want an ice cream, but Daddy said no. It's time to go to school. President Obama loves me. Love, Nigel. You know, only President Obama will allow my son Nigel to go to school with ice cream, apparently. Now, it's often difficult to tell what goes on in the minds of toddlers, but clearly Obama's image as a man of color in the White House has captured my son's imagination, as well as the pride of millions of blacks in the United States and beyond. But the grand bargain of granting black pride in exchange for silence on community-specific issues and the marginalization of targeted policies to address systematic inequality by this administration has left much to be desired. Now, the administration's silence on community-focused issues such as racism in the criminal justice system is evident in the most recent case of Trayvon Martin, a black teenager murdered by a neighborhood watch volunteer in Stanford, Florida. Now, it's understandable why the president did not want to comment on the specifics of a case that is still being investigated, but it has been disappointing to see this president not voice concerns about an issue, race in the criminal justice system, that is of high priority to the most loyal constituency of the Democratic Party, a constituency that just happens to be black. Now, part of the problem is that black leaders and black voters are not pressuring the president on issues like reform within the criminal justice system. But as a constituency with specific issues that need to be addressed, remaining silent on these issues gives the president no incentive to have community-specific issues addressed. But this does not always have to be the case. And so my illustration of this, which I talk about in the book, is actually something that happened in the summer of 2007 when Obama, the candidate, was competing fiercely with Hillary Clinton for the black vote. Now this is, you have to remember, because I think our memory get a little fuzzy before the Iowa victory, right? Because there were discussions within black community about who to support, Hillary or Obama. And actually, in a lot of the polling that was done at the time, Hillary was slightly above Obama among black voters. But something happened in September 28, 2007. The candidate, Barack Obama, gives the most progressive set of proposals and speech on criminal justice reform that I heard from any presidential candidate. Why did he do this? Because he was pressured to do it. There were 15,000 to 20,000 blacks who marched in support of the Gina 6. Remember this group of black male teenagers who were arrested and charged for attempted murder for a schoolyard brawl with a white classmates in Gina, Louisiana. So people are outraged that these black youth were being charged for murder. It seemed like a schoolyard brawl. People were beginning to ask questions like, well, Hillary's commented on this. John Edwards has said, you know, needs for reform in the criminal justice system. Where's Barack Obama? He should be here, including people like Al Sharpton, who's now a presidential advisor, which is a book can be written just on that topic alone, his transformation. But nonetheless, at the speech at Howard University's convocation, you know what the candidate, Barack Obama, again, it's a competition for the black vote. He's behind. Other candidates are speaking about this. There's pressure coming from below because of this march in Gina, Louisiana. If I'm president, this is what Barack Obama says, I will support a federal level racial profiling act. This is not Professor Harris's wish list. about what Barack Obama should be doing. He also promised law students loan forgiveness if they decided to become public defenders as a way to level the playing field for people accused of crimes who couldn't afford an attorney. He thought the best and the brightest lawyers in the country should have that opportunity to become public servants. He also said that he would push for encourage states to do away with the death penalty. Now, one promise he made, he did sort of come through with. He said that he would eliminate the disparities in crack and cocaine sentencing, which he did through the Fair Sentencing Act. He didn't eliminate the disparity. The disparity was 100 to 1, now it's 18 to 1, right? And he recognized in his speech that really the only difference is the color of the skin of most of the users. Right? This is Barack Obama saying this, right? Right? And so what we see here is that when there's competition for black voters and also there's pressure put to bear, we see what the policy consequences of this would be, right? And so, and then he talks about sort of, in very sort of, race-specific terms about discrimination, about, the disappointments, and this is sort of one of my favorite points I like to make. He talks about in a speech at Howard University how the bravery of a president like Dwight Eisenhower, who sent the federal troops in 1957 to desegregate Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so Obama told the Howard University audience, and I'm quoting here, "There are moments when what's truly risky is not to act." Right? And so we see when he becomes president, and this is because people often ask me, well, are there really community issues that are specific to black communities? There are things that sort of affect everyone. That's right, unemployment is one of them. I would argue there needs to be targeted efforts, but given the legacies of discrimination within particular communities, but we can have that discussion. But clearly on issues of criminal justice reform, which overwhelmingly disproportionately affect African Americans as well as Latinos. This is an issue that's community specific, right? And whether you are a cosmopolitan Ivy League professor in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or working class young man in Sanford, Florida, you still are caught up in the unfairness in the criminal justice system. And so that's what I would argue in seeing this sort of this universalist approach to policies. Now another theme, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. So why is it? I talk about in this book that there's this, I talked about deracialization. My shorthand for the theory of deracialization is the wink and nod, right? So this is the idea that doing this strategy, there's an understanding between minority candidates who need the support of white voters for them not to talk about race or race-specific or community-specific policies, and black voters sort of nod. Yeah, I know what you're doing. Yeah, we understand. Once you sort of get in, there'll be greater opportunities. And this is what I call the moving the goalpost argument, because we heard it with Obama. Well, you can't talk about this. Wait till he gets in. He gets in. Well, you can't talk about this. Wait till you get a greater majority after the midterm. Goalpost moves. Goalpost moves again. So he has to get reelected, so he can't talk about these issues. Goalpost moves again. When the president gets reelected, because I think he's going to get reelected, despite the performance last night. I wouldn't be surprised if we hear, well, wait till the next midterm, and then he'll have a larger, the goalpost keeps moving. And so, but also I would say, this another major theme in this book is the tensions between substantive representation and symbolic representation. Substantive in the sense it's really concentrated on policy of a particular community, no matter what the descriptive characteristics of the people representing you. Symbolic, which is an extension of descriptive representation. Descriptive is that people share your same demographic characteristics not necessarily represent the same substantive interests that you represent, but they are there. But there's some symbolic aspects of this where the thought that elected officials who descriptively share your characteristics stand in for your community. They have a symbolic importance to that community. And I would argue the reason why the wink and nod works so much is that the glue that holds the symbolic and the substantive together is trust, right? As long as the constituency trusts the person who descriptively represents you, and they represent the aspirations of the group, people assume that the substantive is okay. Things can go wrong with this, and I know I'm going, because I really want a very robust discussion about some of these issues. When, it's sort of like the comedian, I forget his name, Dave Chappelle, when sort of keeping it real goes wrong, my line for this is when the wink and nod goes wrong. And I want to take you back actually to early 90s, was it 90 or 92, when Clarence Thomas was being nominated for the Supreme Court. And there was a lot of this symbolic language that was being used. If you go through the transcripts of those who were supporting Clarence Thomas, not saying that Clarence Thomas shares the same ideological terrain as Barack Obama, but I'm talking here about the mechanisms, right? Oh, Clarence Thomas will be a role model for black youth. No, I'm not making this up. I mean, yeah. Maya Angelou writes in the New York Times an op-ed piece endorsing Clarence Thomas, asking black Americans to rely on the ancestors' wisdom on this one. We need to rescue this black man for Yale. I think Clarence Thomas will have the maturity, right? You also had several op-ed pieces, I forget the woman's name, she was president of the Historical Black College, Lincoln University. She testified also in support of Clarence Thomas. And she was saying, well, there are always ideological disagreements within the black community. Go back to Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and here we're having at the debate today. I just believe that Clarence Thomas is going to be right on issues of criminal justice reform. He understands growing up as a poor black man in rural Georgia, the struggles of black youth. And no matter that he has a disagreements on, about approaches to civil rights, right? He will be in there for us. As I say in the book, the ancestors' wisdom on this issue is a huge disappointment. Yeah, I'm still, maybe it'll happen next year, next term, or, maybe, we'll see, doing the oral arguments of this affirmative action case in it's Thomas sort of, the ancestors sort of, somehow go into his spirit and become this sort of race man that people thought he was going to be.
I think we need a medium for Clarence.
Okay. But what I'm saying is, it's the wink and nod that happened within that context. And this is different because African Americans were quite divided in public opinion polls. But when the race man said that, when accusations of sexual harassment, this is a high-tech lynching. Public opinion, black public opinion swung 90%.
Circle the wagons.
Yeah, circle the wagons. And so this wink and nod on this issue, the main takeaway here is that just like other constituencies, in the Democratic Party who have been working in very difficult environment, the gay and lesbian community, which I think has been a brilliant campaign. It's reminiscent, I think, of aspects of the best of black politics, the best of the civil rights tradition, have insiders in the White House pressuring the politics, pressuring the president, raising the issue. You have protesters outside. You have the use of the media. People, soldiers saying that, saying that, I'm an American. I'm gay and lesbian, but I can't serve my country, right? So, and it was just not on one issue. It was continuous. At first, because I thought maybe in a sense of appeasement, He did changes in federal regulations for partnerships, very limited. That wasn't enough, right? Don't ask, don't tell. Great, but we want more pressure. Mr. President, what's your views on gay marriage or marriage equality? Vice President blunders, right? And then the president, well, indeed I do support, marriage equality. But this came about only because of pressure. Same things with the Latino community around immigration reform, right? Didn't get the DREAM Act. The president knew in that lame duck section that he did not have enough votes, but the votes came up anyway. And not only that, he did in between by doing stop on deportations. And it's not because they were sitting back and waiting because, this is the first black president, first minority president, we're going to trust them on this one. Because that symbolic stuff doesn't work within the context of those constituencies. They want action, right? And so here we are with this president, and so I want to sort of give you sort of the last lines of my thinking on this. And so the nation's concession to the election of Barack Obama as president of the United States come with an implicit agreement that the forces that keep racial inequality intact will not be directly challenged. While some might argue that the universal policies would ultimately dismantle racial inequality by casting a wide net across Black America, this one-dimensional approach to policymaking will not catch all the social ills facing Black communities. Targeted efforts will be needed. To paraphrase James Baldwin, in his introductory essay for the book, The Price of the Ticket, the nation has, in one hand, surrendered to progress with the election of a black man to the highest seat of power in the land. But in the other hand, the nation still obsessively clutches, and this is Baldwin's phrase, the resources and the goodwill needed to rightly attend to the long-term and persistent problem of racial inequality. For Black America and its leaders, the dispiriting silence to this reality is the price being paid for the election of the nation's first Black president.
Thank you.
Yeah.